sucks. And so do you.
The console war is alive and well, or at least today, temporarily. My name's Magnus. I like to talk about games, old games that come back to life, and remakes and all of that stuff, plus the Shenmue series as well. So if you're into that stuff, and in this case, are on Sega side or Nintendo side, please consider subscribing. Today, we're doing a response gaming, kind of a console wars video, which I really like, against Queen G22, who you see right here in this top left corner of the video. She put out a video talking about Sega Gamers are the worst. And here's why she said what she said. Now, I didn't think that it would be fair to let that video live without giving a Sega fan's perspective on the console wars. Now, don't show her any hate. I actually did quite enjoy her video and her particular take, but she was very insistent that we watch the entire video before we pass judgment. Now, we're going to hit up her comments one by one, and I think it's important that us as Sega fans, or us as just gaming fans, hit up her commentary to see her points, because she brings up 4 pretty strong points from her opinion's perspective, and I think it needs a fair discussion. So let's go without further ado. Queen G22, do not show her any hatred, show her much love. Subscribe to her channel as well. I thought her personality was pretty lively, but we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty because I got a response. Let's go.
Sega sucks. And so do you. Hi, I'm Queen G22. Ninja Turtles gaming geek stuff and travel and...
Now, when it comes to the Ninja Turtles gaming geek stuff, like, I can relate to her as well. So it's a good start. In fact, I am a Ninja Turtles fan as well. This box of Mutate and Raph came out in the 90s. I bought it as a kid, and I didn't buy it on eBay or anything else. And obviously there's wear and tear on the box because I've played with this thing before putting it back in an original box and kept it since my childhood because I hang on to this as a token of what it was like growing up in the 80s and 90s. So we already are off to a good start. Let's keep going.
So I will have documented information of...
She's rocking that Nintendo shirt to make sure that she comes with her bias hard. I like that. You gotta rep what you believe in.
3 points, and then I'm gonna wrap it up, and then you're free to go nuts and...
She actually has 4 points in the video. She kind of gives a bonus, but that's how you keep them going. So good job. Let's see.
Back in the day, see, I was born in 82. Now, I know, I look amazing. That's not the point, okay?
I was born in 1981, so I'm a year older than her. So I should be able to understand her perspective when it comes to this and either find the flaws or agree with her because she's coming from a good place. But let's see where she's coming from.
But most of us were a Nintendo house or a Sega house. And
then... First breakup in this argument. So she's saying you were a Nintendo house or you were a Sega house. And she's showing an NES and then a Sega Genesis. And then she's calling a Sega Genesis. And I know a couple of friends who did this too back in the day. She's calling a Sega Genesis a Sega. I grew up in that same time period. Like I said, I'm a year older than her. And the Sega house and Nintendo house, totally true, unless you had parents that just got you everything. However, in the 80s, specifically in the mid to late 80s, it was Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System, not the Sega Genesis. And it was common to call the Sega Master System just Sega, just like the Nintendo Entertainment System was just Nintendo. In the early to mid 90s, it was Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis. And me, as an original Sega Master System owner in the 80s, I called the Genesis, not the Sega. There were some that did call it Sega, understand that. However, I called it Sega Genesis because Sega to me was the Sega Master System, which was a more graphically powerful console than the Nintendo Entertainment System. However, the Nintendo had third-party licenses that were exclusive to Nintendo that actually gave it a lot of leverage in the late 80s. So that's that. So this comparison right here is a little tiny bit flawed, but I guess for most people to relate. Let's go.
Then there were some of you that you were a one or the other household, but you had a friend or neighbor or family member or whatever that had the other console. So you had access to both consoles, so you never really developed that loyalty to one or the other. But me,
I can tell you that I had a Sega Master System up until 1993 when I switched to actually the Sega CD and Sega Genesis in one time. A cousin of mine actually had the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. I had access to a lot of Super Nintendo games thanks to him. I think he preferred the Super Nintendo. But I still had a Sega loyalty. So it just is what it is.
Nintendo all day, every day. And that's just the way that it was.
Yep.
So I'm a Leo. I'm loyal, period. Like,
That's funny too, because I'm a Leo as well. So I guess that's a thing. Good on you. Agreed.
Going to school and talking trash about Sonic or talking trash about Mario, talking about the new games that were coming out for this console.
Yeah, a lot of the things that especially happened at that time were graphical comparisons between two different versions. And in that time, a lot of the games that were named the same way were developed by two different developers and were completely different. So you argued which one was better. And for those that were on both consoles, you still argued which one was better graphically. 9 times out of 10, it was the Super Nintendo that would win graphically. But Sega sometimes in certain games had a few nuances where Sega's could be potentially more fun or played faster, such as sports games played faster. So obviously I'm still in that rivalry mentality now. I'm comparing it now, but let's continue.
Number 2, my second point. It's the way that...
She's on to number 2, but I will say that I don't get your point on number 1, besides that you just grew up as a Nintendo household. That's why it's better. I could honestly say that I grew up in a Sega household. I will not say that Sega was better. Sega and Nintendo were very different. I had my favorite, but that doesn't mean that Nintendo fans were the worst. That's just my case.
They hung around. They were just doing their thing, minding their business. And here comes Sega with their sole only purpose, not to be competitive with Nintendo, but to take Nintendo down. That's how they came on the scene. They recruited a shark hunting toy guy as their marketer in order to take down Nintendo. You think I'm wrong? Look it up. If you haven't seen Console Wars, I implore you that you go see it. It is...
I'm going to stop her right there before everyone blows up on this, because I know I did when I was watching this. She's saying Sega jumped on the scene, and then of course Sega had their, before you get to it later on, with their intensive Sega does with Nintendo marketing campaign. Yes, Nintendo has been around for a long time, but so was Sega. Developing consoles. The SG-1000. You have the Sega Mark III, which became, in the US, the Sega Master System, in the 80s, competing with Nintendo. Sega didn't jump on the scene with the Sega Genesis. They were around a couple of consoles before that. But in the 80s, Nintendo was the first to strike with their restrictive licensing agreement, where if you wanted to make a game for Nintendo, it had to be exclusive. What Sega did with the Sega Genesis, because the Sega Master System itself, granted, it survived a lot longer than the Nintendo, especially in markets such as Brazil, where it was developing well into the 2000s Sega Master System games, which is an amazing success. Granted, they had a partnership with Tectoy down in Brazil, so they were able to do that and flourish. Sega also had a strong showing in the UK as well with their 8-bit system, where Nintendo just wasn't the same. Nintendo succeeded in the US, so that's where you're seeing it, where Nintendo had the market share of like close to 90%. Why? Because they put the stranglehold on the Sega Master System. Sega didn't jump on the scene. They were already there, being strangled by Nintendo. So Sega decided to put on its gloves and fight back with the Sega Genesis. Sega does what Nintendo don't. Why? Because it was time to take over. And Sega knew that The exclusivity was for the Nintendo Entertainment System. But if those third-party developers developed a completely different game, much better graphically, for the Sega Genesis, they can actually work with Sega. And Sega did that partnership. When those same companies again started working with the Super Nintendo, now there was no longer that exclusivity deal because we're in a whole new different console generation. And yes, Sega came out swinging because they needed to start swinging since they had been eaten up in the market in the late 80s. I'm a Sega Master System huge fanboy, more so than the Sega Genesis, because I had it from the mid 80s, 1986, all the way to 1993, and that's all I was playing. While kids were in the 16-bit, I was in the 8-bit era, but loving what the Sega Master System can do, and I still have a strong attachment to those games. But then, when I got the Sega CD and Sega Genesis, it flourished my love for Sega. But to say Sega came out swinging, no. They had been boxing for a long time. They just had the endurance to actually come out on top when they put on their real gloves. And another note, that Console Wars logo that you're seeing here in that movie, even that is plagiarism. Yes, look at the logo of the Console Wars. Look at the shirt that I'm wearing. This shirt was created by a YouTube channel known as Console Wars. Good buddy of mine, Dan, runs that channel, and that channel is incredible. I suggest you go and subscribe to that channel. They do such a great, entertaining job reliving the console wars from the 90s between Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. That documentary stole the logo completely from that channel, and I'm still kind of not over it. So you're saying go watch it? I have not and don't need to watch that because A, I lived in that, and I'm still miffed that they stole the logo from a small YouTube channel without permission. And that, okay, that's just personal, but did you know that, Queen G22? If not, check them out. It's a good channel. Let's keep watching. Yeah, but this one bothered me.
Is a documentary on Netflix, and I will put it on the screen and the info in the description. And that one kind of breaks it down even before Nintendo. I'm talking Intellivision, ColecoVision, Atari, Channel F, all that kind of stuff. Anyway.
I did watch High Score. High Score was pretty good, but I won't watch Console Wars. Only the YouTube channel.
I digress. Their goal was to take down Nintendo. It wasn't to, have a market. They had their market, and then Nintendo had their market. No, Sega was like, we're gonna come here and we're gonna shut this shit down. You remember, right? Because what do you guys like to say? Sega do what Nintendo don't.
What Nintendo don't.
Like, Nintendo didn't put any slander out towards Sega.
Nintendo did do a couple of jabs at Sega, but Sega was a lot more aggressive.
System. Super NES gives you 4 free games. Sega gives you no free games. Which do you choose? Number 2. Farmer Brown has 4 chickens to trade for a video game system. Super NES gives him 4 free games. Sega, no free games. Which should Farmer Brown choose?
So, yeah, true. But like I said, they've been in the game for a while. They knew what they were doing.
You can't even find your own way into the market. You want to try to bring us down in order to bring yourselves up? That's lame.
Again, Sega had been in the video game industry for a while, a lot longer than what you think, just the Sega Genesis. And honestly, when it comes to those type of tactics, you got to think of the audience that you're trying to lure in. When you're trying to grab the attention of a lot of young kids and teenagers that are always competing what console is better than what, you have to come aggressively and come to the level that they come at you with. The person who did the marketing campaign, he knows that when it comes to toys and when it comes to the child's mentality, competition actually creates interest. And that's what you do. You may own a business, but in some industries, you don't have to compete. I'll give you an example. One of the creative ways in different industry, professional wrestling, back in the mid to late 90s, there were 2 main wrestling companies, WCW and WWF, which eventually became WWE. Now, the WWF never competed against WCW directly, never mentioned their name or anything. But then WCW started basically calling out the WWF in their programming. And with the teenagers of that day, that generated buzz and interest, and guess what? It almost put the WWF into bankruptcy. Now, there were a lot of other things that caused the downfall of WCW in the meantime, and a lot of it has to do with the Time Warner AOL merger, which was disastrous for WCW, and their floundering programming after a while. But to get the attention, to get people to switch the channel, you gotta really go after your competition in those industries where your audience is going to pay attention. It doesn't apply to all, but it works for some. So you can't compare it to say, I'm a business owner and I would never do that. You gotta compete and go after your competition. I think McDonald's and Burger King have done that as well. So many competitors do that. Coke Pepsi debate, like, come on, it's part of the culture, especially when it comes to your audience on which one is better. When you create that conversation, you create interest, and I think controversy creates cash.
Number 3, the third.
So there have been 2 so far, and none are valid. One was just because I grew up in a Nintendo household. The second one is, because Sega was so mean in their marketing. Here we go. Number 3.
Reason why I say so much about Sega, and it's solely on the purpose on how much you guys hate it. You guys cannot stand it. When I say guys, dude, don't get crazy. And I'm old. I mean the hardcore people that...
She called herself old. Now I'm offended. She's not old in my opinion. Yes, I'm using that as an excuse to justify my youth as well. Oh no. Anyway, because Sega fans rile it up and hate it. Yeah, I mean, I agree with her on that sometimes you like to get people riled up. That's why I'm doing this whole response. Let's get you riled up, especially from Nintendo. But yeah, I'm not finding much in this argument.
How upset you guys get. And I think it's interesting. It's kind of like...
I guess that kind of makes me sound like I'm one of the ones that helped generate that buzz. So she got exactly what she wanted with me responding. But when you say irresponsible things, expect to get answered. That's what she wants, and that's what I'll give her.
Like PlayStation gamers, dude, go tell a Nintendo gamer right now that their frames per second sucks, they can't handle high quality games, they'll never be as strong as PlayStation. Go tell a Nintendo gamer that right now. You wanna know what they're gonna say? They're gonna be like, yeah, it's true. Like, we know our role, we know our games, we love our games, we're happy with our games, like we're not trying to compete with PlayStation and...
Here's the part that she's kind of leaving out. When it came to especially the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis era, you could not get a Nintendo fanboy to shut up about how much the graphics were better on Super Nintendo when compared to Sega Genesis. If you looked at the hardware between the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo outclassed the Sega Genesis in almost everything except resolution. So Genesis did have a higher resolution, and Genesis had a faster processor. So you can, like I said, the sports games were generally ran smoother and better on Sega Genesis. But when it came to essential graphics, it had its own unique, like 3D engine in it. I forget what it's called. I'll put it in this video, but where you can just kind of like move around background layers. And then it had the 3D effects chip for Star Fox, and it boasted graphics that no one can touch, Donkey Kong Country, when other systems were coming out with 32-bit processors and 3D technology. Super Nintendo was like, we don't need that. We still have incredible graphics on the Super Nintendo. So you can't say that Nintendo fans were like, meh. No, they talked about it when they had the best graphics in the 16-bit era. Then, when Nintendo decided to go more of an experience and IP-driven developer and console maker, they leaned away so much from the graphics. They were like, meh, we don't care about graphics. It's only because you know you're weaker, so you have to lean on other things, and not shading Nintendo because they know how to sell. But when you lose the argument, you kind of have to do that. If you had better graphics, I guarantee you, you'd be flaunting that everywhere.
Xbox, but tell a PlayStation gamer and a Sega gamer, you guys suck. They lose their shit. Like, they're so defensive. I don't know why that is. Somebody tell me why that is. Is it because of the amount of money that you spend on PlayStation games?
No. If a Nintendo gamer came to a PlayStation or Xbox gamer and said, your graphics suck, we lose our shit, because that argument from a Nintendo gamer is completely illogical. Really makes no sense when you're coming from a much weaker system. So it would be rare to hear that from somebody who's in the Nintendo space, but if they did, we'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? That's why they lose their shit. When you're talking PlayStation and Xbox against each other, at this point, I don't think anyone's really having that argument at this point. And if they are, it's very minute, and it isn't. I mean, you really have to be technically obsessed to have that argument. I'm a PlayStation gamer right now, mostly PlayStation, not so much Xbox. And PC, I do like PC. But, I mean, if someone came at me and said, oh, Xbox graphics are better, and I'd be like, really? Wow, that's pretty cool. That's it. That's it. But if someone said, wow, this game plays better on the Switch than it does on the PlayStation, I'd be like, you've got to be freaking kidding me. There's no way. There's no way. You see why you get that perspective? It's because you're Nintendo.
Nintendo gamers, we're just like, yeah, our games are okay.
Yeah, because that's all you can say. Your games are okay. Your first party games are, for the most part, incredible because you put the time and energy into it. But yeah, your games graphically are okay. You got to sit there and take it, because graphically you can't compete. And third party developers know this as well. That's why they put so much power in the PlayStation and Xbox and PC. Sit down.
And number 4, and this is, I've said my 3 points.
So she said her 3 points. Now it's time for number 4. So 3 points, grew up in a Nintendo household, whatever. Sega came too harsh. You kidding me? Third is because she wants to rile us up with her comments and how angry we get when you insult PlayStation or Xbox graphics compared to Nintendo, who stays quiet. It's because Nintendo would have an illogical argument. I'm not really convinced. What's number 4?
I respect Channel F. I mean, everything that has done something in the gaming history that has put us where we are today in the gaming world. And that includes Sega Genesis, or just Sega. I mean, come on.
Call it Sega Genesis. Call it Sega Mega Drive. Don't call it just Sega, because that title belongs to Sega Master System. So I have one question for you, actually, if you ever see this. First of all, do you own the Sega Master System? You might. Or you said you emulated. Do you have a Sega emulator? Sega Master System emulator. Have you played those games? Have you compared Sega Master System games to Nintendo? Have you seen, for example, the difference between on some games that actually were on both consoles? Double Dragon for the NES versus Double Dragon for the Sega Master System. 2 very different games. Double Dragon for the NES, incredible. Double Dragon for the Sega Master System, also incredible, very different. And you can play 2 players simultaneous, and the graphics are better on the Master System. Have you played Ghostbusters on the Nintendo versus on the Sega Master System? Once you play the Sega Master System version of Ghostbusters, you'll never touch the Nintendo version of that game ever again. Those are just a couple of examples. There are a few more as well. You gotta play Sega Master System. And don't call Sega Genesis a Sega, because it's not.
I did a whole video on modifying my Sega Game Gear. And
okay, you have a Sega Game Gear. Sega Game Gear is based on the actual Sega Master System hardware miniaturized in a portable. Tell me you played the Sega Master System, please.
You continue to fuel me. I like to feed the fire. I think it's fun, but I mean, you can't really hate anything that left their mark in the gaming history. You can't do it. So
I actually appreciate some of the banter, back and forth slander, because you can appreciate someone else's opinion and see their perspective. Because again, a lot of her arguments, they're really catered towards her. A lot of my arguments are catered towards my experience as well. But having these discussions educate people on those classic consoles, which is not a bad thing. I defended Sega, she defended Nintendo. Others who weren't around at that time might look at these videos and say, I think I want to check it out. Or if she's hating on Sega, let me find out why. Or if he's hating on Nintendo, let me find out why. And then it can create, I guess, new fans. So it's appreciated.
but I mean, look at Sega now. Now they're not making consoles because they got blown out. Their Dreamcast and Sega Saturn and 32X or whatever sales were so atrocious it put them out of business. But
Couple of notes on that. Sega Saturn and 32X were horrible marketing decisions, horrible in a lot of ways. The mistakes were made. The Dreamcast was Sega's final hurrah. And there were a couple of things that caused the Sega Dreamcast to kind of fail when it did. I think, although PlayStation had a large effect on why it failed, two events. First was the cost of a lot of their game development. For example, Shenmue. For example, other studios. Sega split out into so many different development studios to push the industry forward and make creative games. That cost them a lot of money to do that. And those different development studios they had internally really are what caused the Sega Dreamcast to be beloved until this day, because they were really pushing creative boundaries and created a lot of IPs in that short time frame that are still loved to this day. But the other thing too is just that because of the poor copy protection on the Dreamcast, and it was incredibly easy without a mod chip to basically burn your own games, that killed the Dreamcast when it came to the fact that you didn't have to buy a game. You could just download it off the internet, pop the CD into the Dreamcast and play it, which killed its sales. In fact, the Dreamcast did incredibly well when it launched, and it had a really, really good library of games to start off with in the US. So, I mean, Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, NFL 2K, just to name a few. Those games were incredible. And then mixed with, of course, the PlayStation 2 coming out shortly thereafter and people just switching over. That caused the downfall, but Sega did what they needed to do to stay relevant. Like I said, they made the smart decision to become a third-party developer, but you had the former owner, before he passed away, gave much of his own cash to Sega to ensure that they lived on while after he passed, which was incredibly noble. That's why Sega's still relevant to this day, and Sega consoles are released to this day with the Sega Genesis Mini and the Sega Genesis Mini 2, and those were really successful and really well designed. It's because Sega's still relevant. And we still want a Dreamcast 2 or whatever else they'd want to call it at this point. The Dreamcast and the Sega CD and Sega Genesis are the only older consoles that I still have connected to my TV as of today.
you catch me on the streets and you bring me that Sega shit, I'm going to back Nintendo all the way, all day.
So that was the Queen G22's video. Definitely consider subscribing to her if you want to see more of her videos and her content. It was actually pretty fun to reply and to defend Sega. Those old console wars are great. Subscribe to the Console Wars on YouTube as well. Give those guys some love. And hopefully you subscribe to me. Let me know if you agree with my perspective or if you want to defend Nintendo. Please let me know. But as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. Hit that like and share. Let's get the word out. Sega for life. See you later.